The day my sister walked down the aisle with my husband, my world shattered. The champagne flutes chimed, a mocking symphony to my pain. I watched them cut the cake, a sickeningly sweet display of a life that should have been mine. They smiled, they laughed, they toasted to their future, oblivious to the storm gathering inside me. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity, the cold-blooded theft of everything I held dear. And that was the day revenge became not just a thought, but a burning necessity. If you have a sister you would do anything for, subscribe now. My name is Ava, and until recently, my life was picture perfect, or so I thought. I had it all, a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a successful career. My husband, Julian, was a brilliant businessman. He had built his empire from the ground up, amassing a fortune that most people only dream of. I was proud of him, of us. We were the golden couple, the envy of our friends and family. But beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life, a darkness was brewing, a betrayal so profound that it would change everything. My sister, Clara, had always been envious. She admired my life, my clothes, my friends, and most of all, my husband. I dismissed it as sibling rivalry, a harmless little thing. I loved her, trusted her implicitly, confided in her my deepest secrets. We were inseparable, or so I believed. Julian, ever the charmer, was always kind to Clara, treating her like a younger sister. I never suspected a thing. The first sign should have been subtle changes in Clara. She started dressing like me, wearing my perfume, even mimicking my mannerisms. At first, I thought it was just innocent admiration, but then it became more pronounced, more unsettling. She began spending more time with Julian, ostensibly to discuss business matters. Julian always brushed it off, telling me that Clara was simply seeking his advice, that she looked up to him. I wanted to believe him, but a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. I pushed it aside, attributing it to my own insecurities. After all, what reason did I have to doubt them? They were my family. Then came the whispers. Friends started commenting on how close Clara and Julian seemed, how they always seemed to be together, how they looked at each other. I dismissed it as gossip, as idle speculation. I refused to believe that my sister, my own flesh and blood, would betray me in such a way. I was blind, willfully ignorant of the storm brewing right under my nose. Julian started working late more often, traveling for business more frequently. He became distant, less affectionate. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would become defensive, accusing me of being insecure and jealous. He said I was imagining things, that I was letting my insecurities get the best of me. I wanted to believe him, but the doubts persisted. They gnawed at me, eating away at my peace of mind. I started losing sleep. My appetite waned, and I became a shadow of my former self. I was slowly being consumed by the fear that my world was about to crumble. One evening, I decided to surprise Julian at his office. I wanted to show him that I trusted him, that I believed in him. I wanted to reignite the spark that had faded between us. When I arrived at his office, the lights were off, but I could hear voices inside. I recognized Julian's voice, and then I heard Clara's. They were laughing, their voices filled with a warmth and intimacy that I hadn't heard in ages. I pushed the door open, and what I saw shattered my world into a million pieces. Julian and Clara were embracing, their lips locked in a passionate embrace. The person I trusted most was one of them. The air thickened, the image burned into my brain. I stood there, frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He told me that he loved Clara, that he had been in love with her for a long time, that he couldn't be with me anymore. Clara simply stood there, smirking, her eyes filled with triumph. They had been planning this for months, meticulously plotting my downfall. They had played me, manipulated me, and stolen everything that was mine. In that moment, I felt a surge of rage, a burning desire for revenge. But I knew that I couldn't lash out, that I couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I swallowed my tears, composed myself, and walked away, a storm raging inside me. The game had just begun. I left that office a ghost of my former self, the perfect life I had so carefully constructed now lying in ruins at my feet. The drive home was a blur, the city lights mocking me with their cheerful glow. How could this have happened? How could the two people I loved most in the world betray me in such a devastating way? I replayed the scene in my head over and over again, each repetition a fresh stab wound. The shock began to wear off, replaced by a burning rage that threatened to consume me. I wanted to scream, to break things, to unleash the fury that was building inside me. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. They wanted me to fall apart, to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I refused to give them that. I would not be their victim. As I walked through the door of what was once our home, I was struck by the silence. It was a silence that screamed of betrayal, a silence that echoed the emptiness in my heart. I wandered through the rooms, touching the objects that held so many memories, each one now tainted under deception. The wedding photos on the mantelpiece, the gifts from our friends, the paintings we had collected on our travels, all reminders of a life that was now a lie. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't bear to be surrounded by the ghosts of our past.
I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left, not knowing where I was going, but knowing that I had to escape. I drove aimlessly for hours, the highway stretching out before me like a dark and uncertain path. I ended up at a small motel on the outskirts of town, a place as desolate and anonymous as I felt. I checked in, went to my room, and collapsed on the bed, exhausted and emotionally drained. Sleep eluded me. My mind raced, replaying the events of the evening, searching for answers, for explanations, for some way to make sense of the senseless. I tossed and turned, haunted by images of Julian and Clara together, their betrayal a constant torment. How long had this been going on? Were all those business trips a lie? Were all those late nights at the office just a cover for their secret affair? The questions swirled in my head, unanswered, unresolved. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I finally drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were filled with nightmares, with scenes of betrayal and heartbreak. When I woke up, I felt even more exhausted than before. The reality of my situation crashed down on me like a ton of bricks. My husband had left me for my sister. My life was in ruins. I had lost everything. But amidst the despair, a flicker of determination ignited within me. I would not let them win. I would not let them destroy me. I would fight back. I started by contacting a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had a reputation for winning even the most difficult cases. I told her everything, laying bare the details of Julian's betrayal and Clara's deceit. She listened patiently, her expression unwavering, and then she told me that I had a strong case. Julian's infidelity was grounds for divorce, and I was entitled to a significant portion of his assets. I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't about the money, but it was about justice. It was about holding them accountable for what they had done. The divorce proceedings were messy and acrimonious. Julian fought me every step of the way, trying to minimize his financial obligations. He accused me of being vindictive and greedy, of trying to ruin him. I refused to back down. I had been wronged, and I deserved to be compensated for the pain and suffering they had caused me. The legal battle dragged on for months, draining me emotionally and financially. I had to sell our house to pay for my legal fees, and I moved into a small apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. I felt isolated and alone, cut off from my friends and family, who seemed unsure of how to react to my situation. Clara, emboldened by her newfound relationship with Julian, reveled in my misery. She would call me, taunting me with details of their happy life together, rubbing salt in my wounds. I tried to ignore her, but her words stung, reminding me of everything I had lost. I started to question myself, wondering if I had done something to drive Julian away, if I had been blind to the signs of their affair. I sank into a deep depression, losing interest in everything that had once brought me joy. I stopped going to work, stopped seeing my friends, stopped taking care of myself. I was consumed by grief and anger, unable to move on with my life. They had almost taken everything, but not quite. The small apartment felt like a cage, the walls closing in on me with each passing day. The silence was deafening, amplifying the echoes of my shattered dreams. I stopped answering the phone, screening calls from well-meaning friends who offered empty platitudes and awkward sympathy. I couldn't bear to hear their voices, their concern a constant reminder of my isolation. Food became an afterthought. I existed on a diet of instant noodles and stale coffee.
my body mirroring the decay of my spirit. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the changing light filtering through the grimy window. I lost track of time, lost interest in everything that had once defined me. I was adrift, lost at sea with no land in sight. One evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, her eyes hollow and devoid of light, her face gaunt and pale. I barely recognized myself. Had I really let them do this to me? Had I allowed their betrayal to consume me completely? A wave of self-loathing washed over me, followed by a flicker of anger, not at them, but at myself, for allowing myself to become a victim, for giving them the power to destroy me. It was in that moment, staring into the abyss of my own despair, that something shifted within me. A spark of defiance ignited, a refusal to surrender. I would not let them win. I would not let them define me. I would reclaim my life, even if it meant crawling through the mud to do it. The first step was to take care of myself. I forced myself to eat a proper meal, to take a shower, to put on clean clothes. It was a small thing, but it was a start. I began exercising again, finding solace in the physical exertion. The sweat, the burning muscles, the pounding heart, they were all a welcome distraction from the pain in my mind. I started reading again, devouring books that challenged me, that inspired me, that reminded me of my own strength and resilience. I reached out to my lawyer, determined to fight back with renewed vigor. I immersed myself in the details of the case, learning everything I could about Julian's finances, about his business dealings, about his vulnerabilities. I discovered that his empire wasn't as solid as it seemed, that he had been cutting corners, taking risks, and engaging in shady practices. He thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong. Everyone has a weakness, and I was determined to find his. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything, my thoughts, my feelings, my plans.
It became my confidant, my sounding board, my weapon. I wrote about their betrayal, about their lies, about their cruelty. I wrote about my anger, about my pain, about my determination to seek justice. And as I wrote, a plan began to take shape in my mind, a plan so audacious, so cunning, so devastating, that it would make them regret the day they ever crossed me. I would use their own arrogance, their own greed, their own deceit against them. I would expose their lies, dismantle their empire, and leave them with nothing. I smiled, a cold, calculating smile that had never been there before. They thought they had broken me, but they had only awakened a sleeping giant. The game was far from over. It was just beginning. From that moment on, Ava disappeared. In her place was something else. The only emotion she felt now was cold, patient focus. They had made a mistake. They had created a monster. My focus shifted. I stopped dwelling on the past and started planning for the future. A future where Julian and Clara would face the consequences of their actions. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but the satisfaction of seeing their downfall would be worth the effort. I started gathering information, quietly and discreetly. I reactivated old contacts, people who owed me favors, people who had access to information that could be useful. I became a ghost, moving through the shadows, observing their lives from afar. I learned about Julian's business dealings, his investments, his debts. I discovered that he had been living beyond his means, that he was heavily leveraged, and that his empire was built on a foundation of sand. I also learned about Clara's ambitions, her desire for wealth and power, her willingness to do anything to get what she wanted. She was a social climber, using Julian as a stepping stone to achieve her goals. They were a match made in Hades, two ruthless individuals driven by greed and ambition. The more I learned, the more confident I became. I knew their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, their secrets. I had the pieces of the puzzle, and now it was time to put them together. I started documenting everything, meticulously recording every detail, every conversation, every transaction. I knew that I needed proof, irrefutable evidence of their wrongdoing. I needed to build a case so strong that it would be impossible for them to deny. I hired a private investigator,
a discreet and resourceful individual who specialized in uncovering hidden truths. He was expensive, but he was worth every penny. He provided me with valuable information, confirming my suspicions and uncovering new leads. He also helped me to protect myself, to ensure that they didn't discover my plans. I knew that they were watching me, that they were suspicious of my motives. They underestimated me, believing that I was still broken and defeated. They thought I was no longer a threat, but they were wrong. I was more dangerous than ever.
I had nothing to lose, and I was willing to do whatever it took to achieve my revenge. The exact day they tried to end me, the truth would surface. They lost everything, and I just smiled. I played the part of the grieving ex-wife to perfection. I went to the mandatory counseling sessions, nodded solemnly at the therapist's platitudes, and even shed a few well-placed tears when prompted. All the while, a tiny voice inside me whispered, "Record everything." I knew Julian would try to use these sessions against me in court, painting me as unstable and emotionally volatile. I made sure to give him nothing he could use, carefully crafting a narrative of heartbreak and resilience. Behind the facade, I was meticulously building my case, gathering evidence, and preparing for the moment when I would unleash my revenge. The private investigator I hired was worth every penny. He uncovered a network of shell corporations Julian was using to hide assets, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a series of questionable loans that were on the verge of default. The investigator also found evidence that Clara had been actively involved in Julian's financial schemes, using her position at the company to funnel money and manipulate accounts. It was even more delicious than I had hoped. I had to be careful, though. Julian was paranoid, and he had eyes everywhere. He started hiring his own people to follow me, to monitor my phone calls, to keep tabs on my movements. I knew I was under surveillance, so I took extra precautions. I used burner phones, encrypted emails, and public Wi-Fi networks to communicate with my contacts. I varied my routes, changed my appearance, and made sure to always be aware of my surroundings. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. One wrong move could blow my entire plan. One evening, I received a call from my lawyer. She had obtained a court order to examine Julian's financial records. This was a major breakthrough. If we could prove that he had been hiding assets and engaging in illegal activities, we could not only win the divorce case, but also potentially bring criminal charges against him. I knew that Julian would do everything in his power to prevent us from accessing those records. He would lie, cheat, and steal to protect his empire. I had to be prepared for anything. The day of the audit arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and dread. I knew that this was a pivotal moment, the beginning of the end for Julian and Clara. I sat in the lawyer's office, waiting for news, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. Hours passed, and the silence in the room grew deafening. Finally, the phone rang. It was my lawyer. Her voice was grim. Julian's office had been raided. The records were gone. He had destroyed them. My heart sank. I had come so far, and now it seemed like everything was falling apart. But then my lawyer spoke again, a hint of a smile in her voice. "Don't worry," she said. "We have a backup." It turned out that my private investigator had anticipated Julian's move. He had planted a hidden camera in Julian's office weeks earlier, capturing everything that happened. The camera had recorded Julian and Clara shredding documents, deleting files, and conspiring to obstruct justice. We had them. I smiled, a slow, satisfied smile. They thought they were so clever, so untouchable, but they had underestimated me. They had underestimated my resolve. They had underestimated the power of a woman scorned. The next step was to leak the evidence to the authorities. I didn't want to be directly involved, so I used an anonymous tip line to send the information to the FBI. Within hours, Julian's office was swarming with agents. He and Clara were taken into custody, questioned, and eventually charged with obstruction of justice, fraud, and a whole host of other offenses. Their world was crumbling around them. Their reputation was in tatters. Their future was uncertain. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, a sense of quiet satisfaction washing over me. It wasn't over yet, but it was a damn good start. I needed to ensure this was airtight. I needed to dot every I and cross every T. That meant bringing in a digital forensics expert to analyze the footage from the hidden camera. I wanted to be absolutely certain that it was admissible in court and that there were no traces of tampering.
The expert confirmed that the footage was authentic and unaltered. He also recovered deleted files from Julian's computer, including emails, memos, and financial statements that further implicated him in his crimes. With the help of my lawyer, I filed a civil lawsuit against Julian and Clara, seeking damages for emotional distress, defamation, and breach of contract. I knew that the legal battle would be long and arduous, but I was prepared to fight. I had the evidence, the resources, and the determination to see it through to the end. I began to leak information to the press, carefully controlling the narrative and making sure that the public knew the truth about Julian and Clara's crimes. The media devoured the story, and Julian and Clara became pariahs. Their friends abandoned them, their business partners distanced themselves, and their social lives evaporated. They were alone, isolated, and facing the wrath of the public. The trial was a spectacle. Julian and Clara, once the darlings of high society, were now villains in the public eye. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters, onlookers, and victims eager to witness their downfall. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, financial records, emails, and testimonial from former employees, all painting a damning picture of their crimes. Julian tried to maintain his composure, but his facade was cracking under the pressure. Clara, on the other hand, was a mess. She sobbed, she pleaded, she blamed everyone but herself. It was pathetic.
During a break in the trial, I received a message from my private investigator. He had discovered something unexpected, something that could completely destroy Julian. Apparently, Julian had a secret family. Years ago, before he met me, he had fathered a child with another woman. He had paid her off to keep quiet, but the woman had kept records of everything. The investigator had located the woman and her child, and they were willing to testify against Julian. This was the final nail in his coffin. I knew that revealing this information would not only destroy his reputation, but also have significant legal and financial consequences for him. He had built his entire life on lies, and now those lies were about to be exposed. I decided to save this revelation for the perfect moment, the moment when it would inflict the most damage. I wanted to watch him squirm, to see the look on his face when he realized that his world was about to collapse. The trial resumed, and the prosecution continued to build its case. Julian's lawyers tried to discredit the evidence, but their efforts were futile. The truth was undeniable. As Julian took the stand in his own defense, he swore under oath that he had never committed any crimes. He denied all the allegations, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy. It was a bold move, but it was also a desperate one. I knew that he was lying, and I was ready to expose him. As he finished his testimony, my lawyer stood up to cross-examine him. She approached the witness stand with a calm, confident demeanor. "Mr. Sterling," she began, "is it true that you have a child you've never acknowledged?" Julian's face paled. He stammered. He hesitated. He tried to deny it, but the truth was written all over his face. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. The judge pounded his gavel, demanding order. My lawyer pressed on, presenting evidence of Julian's secret family, photos, documents, and testimony from the woman and her child. Julian was exposed. His lies were shattered. His reputation was ruined. The prosecution rested its case, and the jury began its deliberations. I sat in the courtroom, waiting for the verdict, my heart pounding in my chest. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Sterling, guilty on all counts." A wave of relief washed over me. Justice had been served. Julian was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat. Clara, who had been watching from the gallery, burst into tears. Their empire had crumbled. Their lives were in ruins. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. I had spent so much time and energy seeking revenge that I had neglected my own life. I was still broken, still scarred, still struggling to move on. I knew that I needed to find a way to heal, to forgive, to rebuild my life.
The first step was to let go of the past, to release the anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long. I decided to sell my story, to write a book about my experiences. I wanted to share my story with others, to inspire them to overcome their own challenges and to find strength in the face of adversity. I also wanted to use the proceeds from the book to help other victims of betrayal and abuse. It was a way to turn my pain into purpose, to create something positive out of something negative. As I began to write, I realized that the act of telling my story was incredibly cathartic. It allowed me to process my emotions, to make sense of what had happened, and to find closure. I poured my heart and soul into the book, revealing every detail of my journey, from the initial betrayal to the final victory. I didn't hold back,
I didn't sugarcoat anything. I just told the truth. The book was a success. It became a bestseller, and I was invited to speak at conferences, on television, and on podcasts. I shared my story with millions of people, and I received countless messages from readers who had been inspired by my words. I realized that I had found my purpose in life, to help others heal and to find their own strength. I started a foundation to support victims of betrayal and abuse. We provided counseling, legal assistance, and financial support to those who needed it most. We also worked to raise awareness about the issue of betrayal and to promote healthy relationships. I found love again, a man who cherished me, respected me, and supported me unconditionally. He was everything that Julian was not. We built a life together, filled with love, laughter, and happiness. I finally found peace. I had come full circle. I had transformed from a victim to a survivor, from a seeker of revenge to a champion of justice. I had reclaimed my life, and I had never been happier. But one final task remained. Julian and Clara had to face the full weight of their actions. I sent a message to Julian in prison, a single photograph. It was a picture of me, standing in front of their former mansion, now a homeless shelter funded by my foundation. The message was clear. They had lost everything, and I just smiled. The photo was just the beginning. It was a carefully crafted psychological operation designed to dismantle Julian from the inside out. His prison cell was small, cold, and sterile, a perfect reflection of the life he had created for himself. The knowledge that his former mansion, the symbol of his success and power, was now a safe haven for the very people he had exploited and disregarded, it was the ultimate karmic retribution. He couldn't escape the irony, the sheer poetic justice of it all. Every day he was reminded of his failure, of the life he had lost, and of the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Meanwhile, Clara was faring no better.
Stripped of her wealth, her status, and her reputation, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. Her social circle evaporated. She had become a social pariah, whispered about in hushed tones and openly shunned by those who once fawned over her. She was now working a dead-end job at a department store, a far cry from the luxury boutiques she once frequented. She was completely alone, haunted by the memories of her past and consumed by bitterness and regret. The civil lawsuit was the final blow. The evidence was overwhelming. Julian and Clara were found liable on all counts and ordered to pay a massive sum in damages, a sum that effectively wiped out what little remained of their fortune. The judge also imposed a restraining order, barring them from contacting me or coming within a certain distance of my home or workplace. It was a symbolic gesture, but it gave me a sense of security and closure. I knew that they could no longer harm me, that they were powerless to interfere with my life. I finally felt free. The divorce was finalized shortly thereafter. I walked away with everything I wanted: my freedom, my dignity, and a sense of justice. I used the settlement money to expand my foundation, to reach even more victims of betrayal and abuse. I also invested in my own future, pursuing my passions and building a life that was truly fulfilling. I traveled the world, I learned new skills, I made new friends, and I embraced every opportunity that came my way. I had transformed myself from a victim to a victor, from a wounded woman to a warrior for justice. I had found my purpose, and I was living it to the fullest. Julian eventually tried to appeal his conviction, clinging to the hope that he could somehow overturn the verdict and reclaim his freedom, but his efforts were futile. The evidence against him was too strong, and the court upheld the original ruling. He was forced to serve his sentence, spending his days in a cramped cell, reflecting on his mistakes and facing the consequences of his actions. He became a shadow of his former self, broken, defeated, and filled with remorse. He had lost everything: his freedom, his wealth, his family, and his reputation. He had no one to blame but himself. The news reached me through the grapevine. I heard that Julian had become withdrawn and isolated, refusing to speak to his fellow inmates and spending most of his time alone in his cell. He was a pariah, even within the prison walls. I felt a pang of pity for him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of cold satisfaction. He had brought this upon himself. He had made his choices, and he had to live with the consequences. I focused on my own life, on my own happiness, and on the work that I was doing to help others. I refused to let Julian continue to haunt me,
to steal my joy, or to define my future. I had moved on, and I was never looking back. I found solace in my work, in my relationships, and in my own personal growth.
I surrounded myself with positive people who supported me, encouraged me, and loved me unconditionally. I learned to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made in the past and to embrace the opportunities that lay ahead. I realized that true happiness comes from within, from accepting yourself, from loving yourself, and from living a life that is aligned with your values. I had finally found that happiness, and I was determined to hold on to it. Time passed. Years turned into decades. The memories of Julian and Clara began to fade, replaced by new experiences, new relationships, and new challenges. I continued to run my foundation, expanding its reach and impact, and helping countless victims of betrayal and abuse. I wrote another book, sharing more of my story and offering guidance and support to those who were struggling to overcome their own challenges. I became a public speaker, traveling the world and inspiring audiences with my message of hope, resilience, and justice. I lived a long and fulfilling life, surrounded by love, laughter, and purpose. I never forgot what had happened to me, but I refused to let it define me. I had transformed my pain into power, my anger into action, and my despair into hope. I had become a symbol of strength, a beacon of light, and a champion of justice. And then, one day, I received a letter. It was from Julian. He was nearing the end of his life, and he wanted to apologize. He admitted his mistakes, he acknowledged the pain he had caused, and he begged for forgiveness. He said that he had spent his years in prison reflecting on his actions, and that he had finally realized the error of his ways. He was a changed man, he claimed, and he desperately wanted to make amends. I read the letter with a mixture of emotions, skepticism, sadness, and a hint of compassion. I knew that Julian was a master manipulator, and I couldn't be sure if his apology was genuine. But I also knew that everyone deserves a second chance, and that forgiveness is essential for healing. I decided to write back. I told Julian that I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own. I said that I had moved on with my life and that I no longer harbored any anger or resentment towards him. I wished him peace and closure, and I encouraged him to use his remaining time to make amends for his past mistakes. I never heard from him again, but I knew that I had done the right thing. I had released the final burden of my past, and I had finally found complete and utter peace. As I sat on my porch, watching the sunset, I reflected on my journey. I had been through hell and back, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. I had faced my demons, I had conquered my fears, and I had transformed my life into something beautiful. And in the end, I had achieved justice. They lost everything, and I just smiled. Revenge isn't sweet, it's necessary. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments.
Subscribe for more justice.